Hello, welcome to a quick video on values and types in the Python programming language. This video is designed to introduce you to an understanding, a concept called types in the Python language. You see, when we deal with numbers or statements or words, anything that has what we call a value, values all have types, and types are something that are not readily seen, but there's something that need to be they're a concept that need to be understood, because Python acts on different types in different ways. Okay, so what are we talking about here? You've seen so far we've done just some simple print statements. And typically, when we're printing something to the screen, it's contained in quotation marks. And whenever we contain something in quotation marks, okay, we put it in, let's say, double quotes, for instance, that's what we call a string. And anytime we say print, quote, hello, my name is X, whatever it is, close quote, close parenthesis, we're telling the computer, hey, print exactly what I tell you to do. I'm putting it in quotation marks. I want you just to repeat exactly what I'm telling you to do. That is what we call a string. Okay, so it may be the most common in the computer science world is our hello world. You may have seen that before. That's an example of a string. Okay, let's move on to a floating point. What is a floating point? Well, this is a number that contains a decimal place. 17.5, 3.9, 1024.6. All floating point numbers, they have a decimal point and then at least one digit after the decimal point. Okay, pretty straightforward. Okay, now on to integers. What's an integer? If you remember this from your math classes, an integer, really it's just a whole number. So if I was to convert these floating point numbers to integers, they would look something like this: 17, 3, and 1024. Notice there's no decimal place present. It's a whole number. We call that an integer. Okay, so what does this look like now? And why is this important to understand these types? Well, we'll talk a little bit about that. First of all, how do we know in Python, how do we know what type of value is? Well, Python conveniently has given us a built-in function called the type function. And we can use it like this. We can put a value, insert a value within the type function, and it's going to return what type it is. And these are all examples of objects. And this is really beyond the scope of the class, but just know we're going to see that we actually get this when the type value returns something to us, it's going to return an object of type integer, float, or string. Again, there's more types, but these are the three we're going to cover today. So let's open a gadget editor. I've got one open. I've got my Canvas gadget editor open. And let's just run through some code so you can see this in practice. Okay, our first two examples here. We have where we're printing these out, print type of 17. Okay, that looks like an integer. So we expect to see an integer there. And then we have 17.5. That looks like a floating point number. Let's see if those types are what we think they are. I'm going to hit the run button or the play button up here to run the code. And look what the output is. Class, I said over here, I said object. And object and class they're referencing, an object is a realization of a class. So it's a class integer and then a class float. Okay, that's straightforward. Let's take a look at some other examples. Let's take a look at some strings. Now, notice here, we've got three different types of strings. Well, there's actually one type of string, three different ways to do it. In the first example, in line 3, we're just using single quotes, quotation marks. single quotes. This is the convention most often used in Python. However, on line 4, you can see we can use double quotes, and in line 5, we're using triple quotes. The point here is they're all valid. They're all strings. So I'm going to run this, and we should see, and what we expect, they're all of type string. Now, why 3 different ways to do things? Well, here's one example here I've got commented out. Let's remove the pound sign so we can run the code. I've got an example here. I'm going to print out, I don't like COVID. Notice within this statement, I'm using the word don't, which contains a single quote. Well, I need a way to differentiate between a word that I want the computer to print to the output versus the whole string. So notice I start now with double quotes on the outside, and then I can use a single quote as I see fit in the middle of the string. So let's print that and give that a try. And you can see that works just like it should. I don't like COVID-19. Now, an example of triple quotes, if we were to print a statement like you would find in a text or a book where you're actually quoting someone verbatim. And so I have in this example, she said, quote, I like to program, quote, and then I've got this wrapped in triple quotes. So I'm going to run this. So let's comment it out. Let's remove the comment rather and print that. And you can see we can actually print now the double quotes. Of course, the quotes on the outside of the string that essentially define the string, they don't show up. Okay, she said I like to program. Good. Very, very good. Okay, let's move on to numbers. Important thing here to note is simply that when we talk about numbers, specifically integers, it's common in our language to use commas, 42, comma, 000. Note when I run this, the computer is going to interpret this actually as 2 separate numbers. It thinks we're asking it to print the number 42 and then the number 0. So let's go ahead and do that. And then I've just printed 42,000 below it to show the difference. You see the difference in that top line? It's actually interpreting this as 2 different values when in fact we really wanted to say 42,000. So just remember, no commas in your integers, no commas. That goes for floating point too. No commas in any kind of numeric representation. All right, straightforward. All right, let's move on to what we're doing now, type conversion. I'm going to go back to the drawing here. There are some times, and change colors, there are some times within our programming we want to do what's called type conversion, sometimes called casting. We want to change a string to a float, perhaps. Maybe we want to change a string to a float, or we want to change an integer to a float, or we want to change a float to an integer. We could go any which way on this. We could change an integer. I don't get too many arrows here. We could change an integer to a string. And why is that important? Well, again, when we get into mathematical operations or we're trying to combine strings together, different operators, like the plus sign, for instance, they're going to act differently depending on the value's type. Okay, let's go back to our code and run a couple examples. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to take, on line 4, we're going to take 3.115 and convert it to an integer. And then we're going to do the same for 3.99. We're going to do a negative floating point number. And then we're going to do check the type of a certain value here. So let's go ahead and run this. Notice what happens. Our 3.115, when we convert that to an integer, all of the decimal points get dropped. I want to emphasize this. They get dropped, they don't get rounded. That becomes clear in the next line of output. 3.999, when we convert that to an integer, doesn't matter how close it is to 4, those decimal points get dropped. It gets truncated, and it simply becomes 3. The same is true for negative numbers as shown there. And then lastly, here we're just showing the example. This is actually a string, the string 1024. Okay, and we're using the type function here, and it's saying, hey, that's a string. Then we're using the type function after we convert 1024 to an integer, and sure enough, just like we expect, it in fact is transformed to an integer. Now just an example here that doesn't work. Okay, I've got 1024 bytes. I've got the string 1024 bytes. I'm going to try to convert that to an integer, and hopefully you're seeing what I'm seeing. We can't convert these alpha characters to numbers. Well, not in this manner anyway. Okay, the computer at this point is going to say, hey, I don't know exactly what you're trying to do, but this 1024 bytes, it's not a clean number representation, numeric characters, so therefore I'm going to throw an error. And sure enough, we run that and we get a value error. Okay, that's what we'd expect. Okay, a couple more quick examples. Let's show what happens when we convert the integer 3 to a floating point number and 1024 to a floating point number. What do you think is going to happen? Let's run and check it out. Well, 3 integer becomes 3.0. Remember, every floating point number has a decimal and at least one numeric character after the decimal point. Okay, 1024 becomes 1024.0. If we do the same thing as the last one here, we try to do some kind of string with alpha characters in there, bytes, bytes, the computer is going to say, I don't like this. This does not make sense to me. Okay, last example, and we'll wrap this up. We're going to take here and convert some integers and floats to strings. And in just the same way, notice these functions that we're using. str, float. That's how we do the type conversion. I probably didn't make that clear. int. Those are the functions we use to convert these values. So now we're going to take 17, the integer. We're going to convert it to a string. And same with 17.5, and then we're going to check the type just to make sure this is working. We're going to check the type of 17.5 after we convert it to a string. Let's take a look. Here's the one thing I want you to notice here. If we say print, in fact, I'm going to add it here. So we've got 17, 17.5. We've got this is a string type. But if I say print 17, notice here, these look exactly the same. So a point here I want to end on this. The output looks the same, but those are of different type. They're of different type. I can run the type function here, and we know this is going to be a string because we're converting it to a string. I know this is an integer because it's an integer, and I can run this. So they look the same, but they have different types. You really got to pay attention to what type your values are, or later on what your variables are, because the Python is going to treat those values differently. I hope this was helpful and helped you understand types a little bit more. Remember, they exist. You can't necessarily see them. If you have a question, call the type operator, find out what kind of your value, find out what type you're dealing with, and that'll help you make better decisions in your implementation in your coding. Until next time, we'll see you later.